I'm very pleased to be interviewing my mentor, colleague, and friend for half a century, Professor Maxwell McCombs, who is now retired from the University of Texas. So, Max, you majored in journalism as an undergraduate at Tulane University. You worked as a reporter for the New Orleans Times-Picayune and subsequently earned a PhD in communication research at Stanford. What prompted your evolution from journalist to social science researcher?
In my senior year at Tulane, one of my professors, Walter Wilcox, met with me and recommended that rather than immediately taking a job on a newspaper, I should go to Stanford and get a master's degree. 3 months after graduation, I was on a westbound train headed for Palo Alto, California, to enter the master's program there. At that time, Chilton Bush, who was chairman of the Department of Journalism and Communication, was also the graduate advisor for all new students. So I set up a meeting with Bush, and I'm sitting in the anteroom to his office, and he comes storming out of the office, paying no attention to me or the other graduate students who are there, drops a huge pile of file folders on his secretary's desk, and exclaims, "These goddamn graduate students are driving me crazy." And he stormed back into his office. About 2 minutes later, his secretary said, "Dr. Bush will see you now." And so I entered his office, not being sure what to expect. He motioned me to sit down and immediately said, "Walt," referring to Professor Walter Wilcox, "Walt told me all about you. What you want to take is Wilbur Schramm's theory course, my content analysis course, go over to the psych department and get a statistics course. And while you're there, take a learning theory course." He wrote these 4 courses on a notepad, tore off the top page, handed it to me and said, "Go home and think about it and come back tomorrow." Those were the courses I enrolled in. As I was finishing up my master's, Bush said, "We prefer that our PhD students have professional experience. So you need to go get a job on a newspaper. And after a few years, come back and finish your PhD, and we will support you all the way." My master's degree at Stanford was, in effect, the first year of the PhD program. I discovered a wonderful new area of intellectual interest. The spring of 1967, I had just finished my PhD and was on the journalism faculty at UCLA. And it was a nice tradition that the junior faculty members met most Friday afternoons. The formal announcement my office mate posted would say, "The Junior Faculty Association will meet at the Century Plaza Hotel at 4 o'clock. Well, actually, that meant we were going to the bar at the Century Plaza Hotel at 4 o'clock. And on one of those Friday afternoons, the conversation turned to a day that week in the news when there were 3 news stories on the same day, any one of which in isolation would have been the lead. And we began to speculate, well, what happens to the impact of the other 2 stories? One story becomes the lead. In that particular instance, the other 2 stories got dropped below the fold. They were still on the front page, but they were clearly down. And it was an interesting conversation, speculating about how that play of a story, in part dictated by what else was happening, might change its impact. Then there was an up-and-coming politician named Ron who got elected governor of California and took an axe to the University of California budget. So I decided not a good place to be a very junior assistant professor. That's when I went to Chapel Hill. That's where I met Don. We had never met before.
We quickly became friends, and we began to talk about, well, how could we study Lippmann's idea?
I'm driven to write. It's like a pill. If you don't take a pill, you can get by it a day or two. I'm not happy if I don't write. I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and have for the past 46 years. I'm going to retire next year. The profession has undergone a lot of change, so it's a radically different world from what it was when I started nearly half a century ago. I've always enjoyed teaching news writing because I found that you can see progress so clearly. So it's like cutting the grass. You can see where you've cut the grass. I had a young student come to me and say, "Professor Shaw," she said, "I just want to thank you." She said, "I was in your news writing class and I just won a press award." And that's probably the most, I treasure that remark. I mean, the thing. I like students, I like teaching, I like writing, and I hate to give up the students, but I'll continue to write. Sometimes you start out, you don't know where you're going to end up, but just by a stroke of luck, I started a good place, I ended at a good place. Because when Max came down the hall, we had to do a content analysis. That's always a part of agenda setting studies. And my own background was in doing content analysis. I just finished my PhD where I'd done content analysis. His background's in the social sciences. Mine was in history and a little bit of social science. His social science and history. So I took on responsibility for that, trying to see what the local papers were doing in the issues. And then we found in the original study high correlation, so we wrote a paper about it and sent it off to the Association for Education and Journalism, to the Theory and Methodology Division. And so we sat back, anxious young professors waiting, and we didn't have to wait too long. It was rejected summarily. And so I remember Max didn't even tell, he was the corresponding author. He didn't even tell me about it for a long time. Finally, he walked down the hall with a paper and told me about it. And we were trying to decide what to do. We had it metaphorically poised over the trash can, and Max recommended we do some revising, and not a lot of revising, and send it off to Public Opinion Quarterly, and that's what we did. And it turned out to be the right time for that type of study, since Clapper had found, he said, no evidence of attitude change. Was there evidence of cognitive change? There definitely was evidence of cognitive change, dramatic. I don't care what the Theory and Methodology Division felt about it. But so it found its way. So I often tell that because I like to tell young scholars or beginning scholars, when you get a rejection, boy, that's exciting. You must really be owed to something. Keep going.
Historical footnote on that. A few years ago, Public Opinion Quarterly celebrated its 75th anniversary because it goes back to the 30s. And they look back at the fate of articles that had been published in the journal and identified the Chapel Hill study as the most cited study the journal had ever published.
Elements that are prominent in the media frequently become prominent in the public mind. Well, a good place to begin with an explanation of the idea of agenda setting is actually to go back to Walter Lippmann's classic book on public opinion, published early in the last century. He began that book with a chapter titled "The World Outside and the Pictures in Our Heads." It was Lippmann's thesis that the news media, primarily newspapers in his day, were the bridge between that world outside and the pictures in our heads, that the pictures were a reflection of the media, not necessarily of what was really happening in the world outside. So now the kind of a general explanation of the core of agenda setting would be elements that are emphasized in the media come to be regarded as important among members of the public. The general proposition for agenda setting is about the transfer of salience from one agenda to another. And if you're exposed enough to a particular agenda, whether it's a news agenda, the Jay Leno agenda, or whatever, and it can even extend far beyond media, then people, if that resonates with them, are going to respond. They're going to perceive those elements, whatever they are, as important.
Agenda setting, let me define first, borrowing from Bernard Cohen, a political scientist. Agenda setting says that the media do not tell us what to think, but do tell us what to think about. And you can see on the figure that we have here that the main topics that a medium has are indeed transferred over time to the audience. We should not be surprised because the medium is a stimulus, and the audience, if interested, is going to attune itself to the stimulus and learn from it. It's what we do as human beings. Additional research has found that this level of agenda setting, which is called agenda setting level 1 topics, can be extended even to the details of topics or attributes of topics. You'll see in the figure that's in front of you now that you might have topic A and topic B and topic C, and the details of topic A as 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And as they appear in the medium, they're also appearing in the memories, when you ask them, of audiences who've attuned themselves to the media. So agenda setting does indeed, as promised, tell you what to think about, and maybe a little bit how to think about it, because it tells you the topics and a little bit how the attributes are mixed up.
In Charlotte, we introduced an idea called need for orientation.
Most individuals, when they find themselves in an unfamiliar situation, are a bit uncomfortable until they kind of orient themselves to their surroundings. And this could be as varied as the first time you came to this campus and you probably had no idea where most of the buildings or offices you needed to go to really were, or maybe even which buildings and offices you needed to go to, that is, you had a need for orientation. Need for orientation, as David Weaver introduced this concept, most of us have no need for orientation at all toward any number of topics because we don't consider them relevant.
Increasingly, people say they don't trust the media, and there's a large group of people who are quite convinced that there's a liberal bias. Is there a liberal bias to?
No. And in fact, there's been a great deal of research on this, and the evidence is simply not there. And indeed, one increasingly could argue for the dominant national media, if there is a bias, it's probably a conservative bias, particularly when you look at the salaries of the major personalities on television. These are not poor people. These are not working class people. These are among the financial elite of our country. And their interests typically do not run to the liberal side of the political spectrum. The evidence suggests that most of the news plays pretty much right down the middle. Don and I have looked back and to see when did we actually come up with the name agenda setting? And we don't know. I brought with me copies for Don and Dave of a historical document. You know, I'm at the point in life, I'm cleaning out files and discarding a lot of stuff, but I found 3 copies of our report on the study to the National Association of Broadcasters, because they provided the small grant that paid for the survey research work. in Chapel Hill. So, we had to give them some kind of report. Interestingly, when we explained how we spent the money, we had given them an original budget, and by the time it was over, 75% of the money was spent on miscellaneous. But I don't think anyone at the NAB ever really looked at the report. We never got a question about that. When we did the proposal, there's no mention of agenda setting. It's a description of the study we did. By the time we sent the NAB our report, roughly a year later, actually a little less than a year later, we're using the term agenda setting like it's been there forever. Somewhere along the way, there was a spark, but we don't know exactly when that term came into being or when said, oh, hey, we got a theory here on our hands. Yeah, and as it continued to add facets, where does the media agenda come from? What are the consequences of agenda setting effects? And certainly the more recent ones, network agenda setting and agenda melding.
Agenda melding is the process by which we as individuals blend the messages from various media into a coherent picture of the world. Traditional media are vertical in orientation. They're like reach down for large audiences as if from the top of a pyramid, because they're reaching for large audiences indiscriminately, whether or not they're men or women, rich or poor, tall or short. Whereas horizontal media or social media are often reaching for people who agree with the topic or interested in the topic, such as a sports magazine or a fashion website or a particular site on the web for someone who's interested in fly fishing or something of that nature. So these are appeal to the two sides of our interests. Part of all of us is interested in the general community in a vertical-like way, and part of us in how all of us really have our lives enriched by being involved in people like ourselves and activities we like horizontally, as it were.
In the future,
A major frontier is the expansion of network agenda setting to create integrated networks of the media agendas of multiple sources. Most of the research at present in terms of a network analysis of media agenda involve the media agenda of one news source, the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. But if we approach this in a broader way of integrating those networks, that galaxy of news agendas can detail in much more nuanced and complete ways what the public experiences in the news. I call this the Rubik's Cube problem for a network agenda setting, that is, construction of a three-dimensional macro network that both preserves the nuances of individual agendas and examines the intermediate agenda setting influences among the media.
I do think that agenda setting is deceptively simple, and I've made this remark in other talks. It's like going to the Tower of Pisa and getting 2 lead balls and controlling the air, and you drop a 1-pound lead ball and a 10-pound lead ball, and they hit at the same time. So, let's do logs. Let's do a 1-pound log and a 10-pound log, and do a 1-pound log and 10-pound log. And I said, well, let's do a possum, a 1-pound possum and a 10-pound possum. And usually the audience is a little bit restive when I make that remark. And if they are, I go ahead and say, well, let's do babies. Let's do a 1-pound baby and a 10-pound baby. An awful lot of agenda setting search is like dropping 1-pound and 10-pound whatever off, and it always shows up pretty predictably. It is time to move on from some of that kind of thinking. And there are all kinds of opportunities now to look at these kinds of studies using data already gathered up in the cloud. And if you have ingenuity and methodological rigor and standards, you can do a lot of studies just from your own chair with a good computer access and a good program on your computer by looking at your and testing hypotheses and pushing the theory further on, which of course is all our goals.
Agenda setting has become an international research area with scholars across the world being very active and making contributions. I'm very proud to have been part of that international expansion. The other part of my legacy is pushing this idea of theoretical research, following the example set for me by the field of physics, continuing to push, expand, raise new questions, and continue to better inform our theoretical view of how the news media have an impact on public opinion.
And I will end with a quote from one of my favorite fictional characters, Sherlock Holmes, who often began a new case by saying, "Come, Watson, come. The game is afoot."